This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Human Action Podcast. Today I'm going to be speaking about international trade theory. So this episode will be particularly relevant for those of you who are trained economists or who are getting a master's or higher, if you're a student. But also, of course, undergrads are welcome to listen in. And those of you who follow these arguments, especially like over Trump's tariffs and things like that, this will all be relevant to you folks, and I'll try to keep it accessible. But there is, among other things, what we're going to cover is what's called Lerner Symmetry Theorem. And it goes back to this famous 1936 article in Economica by Abel Lerner, who, in case that name is familiar to you in Austrian circles, he was one of the market socialists, right? So it was Oscar Lange and Abel Lerner who tried to defeat Mises and Hayek in the socialist calculation debate by appealing to the idea that, the central planners could just mimic a market economy, just tell all the production, the managers of the factories or whatever, we're going to announce this vector of prices, and then you go ahead and optimize accordingly, but we can improve on what the market would do, right? When they would go ahead and do it. So anyway, they thought they were showing Mises' critique of socialism, saying we can't calculate, can't be right because we could just mimic the market economy if we wanted to, right? So anyway, it's the same guy, but he, in 1936, had an article called The Symmetry Between Import and Export Taxes. And again, this is pretty famous if you go on in economics and talk about international trade. This is like a baseline result. So as I'll explain as we go through this episode here on the Human Action Podcast, he makes a lot of simplifying assumptions. And so much of the work in international trade theory since this came out has been to try to generalize the results and see, how much does his counterintuitive result rely on these unrealistic assumptions and blah, 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 right? But anyway, I thought it would be good for me to go ahead and spell this out because it is an intriguing result. And then once you think it through, it's like, it's obvious. But at first, when you hear it, it sounds crazy. All right, so let me give you the news hook, just in case you're wondering. Yeah, this sounds like it might be a lot of brain processing, and I don't know if I want to deal with this, Murphy. So the news hook was recently, I think it was October 10th, Trump came out saying he was going to have 100% tariffs on China. Markets went haywire. And then I saw this interesting tweet where a guy said, what's funny is that Econ 101 says that when a country imposes a new tariff, it should make its currency strengthen. And yet every time Trump has done a surprise announcement with tariffs, the dollar falls, or something like that. And then people were piling in the comments trying to explain what, why is that and whatever. And people were bringing up Lerner Symmetry Theorem. So to be clear, Lerner Symmetry Theorem relies on that mechanism, right? So it's not that that's actually an explanation as to why the Econ 101 thing is off. And by the way, I don't think I learned this in Econ 101. I think this is more like Econ, 401, let's say, because it's kind of, takes it to the next level. But in any event, that was kind of the news hook for this. And then that's what makes me want to explain it. And also, we're not merely going to talk about the Lerner Symmetry Theorem here in this episode. I'm going to talk more broadly about the fact that what happens if when you take into account the impact on your currency strength from a tariff. And this is interesting because here on the Human Action Podcast, Stephen Moran was the guy who wrote this document, and Stephen Moran is now the head of Trump's Council of Economic Advisors. Yeah, this was the Human Action Podcast episode that we aired it back on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2025. Okay, and the title we had at the time was Unpacking the Document That Spells Out Trump's tariff strategy. All right, so I had my guest for that episode was Josh Hendrickson, and so we were going over this 41-page document that had been put out in November of 2024, right? So after, or just as Trump is winning his reelection, but before he's sworn in. And so Stephen Moran, who, among other things, he's a Harvard PhD in economics, all right? So this isn't some guy from Wall Street or something that just, being friendly to Trump and then gets this post. I mean, he's a Harvard-trained economist. And anyway, was made Trump's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. And so in that document, he was explaining how to use tariffs as well as other pro-growth reforms to solidify the dollar's status as the international reserve currency, but also reduce the trade deficit and so on. Okay, so one of the things that Moran pointed out in that paper was he was saying a lot of the critics of Trump who don't like tariffs say that it's going to hurt consumers, but they're overlooking the fact that the U.S. being a big player on the world stage, if it imposes large tariffs, among other things, that will lead to a strengthening dollar. And then, so that means that consumers won't be hurt as much as the critics of the tariffs might lead you to believe, because there's this offsetting effect that the tariff is not going to make foreign goods make them more expensive to the same degree that you might have originally thought, because the dollar is going to strengthen and partially offset that result or that effect. Okay, so I'm just saying that this notion that the currency might strengthen in response to a new tariff being imposed isn't just some weird thing that some market socialist from 1936 said, but it's not relevant. It's something that the guy Trump picked to be the head of his Council of Economic Advisors. It's one of the effects that he cited when he was trying to explain why tariffs are not as awful as the critics would have you believe. And that it's not just, it's just a tax on consumers and it's going to make everything more expensive at the grocery store. And he was trying to say, well, no, they're overlooking this obvious effect that the literature has, known for whatever, almost a century now. Okay, so this isn't like some weird partisan thing. Okay, so these are all related, but then the issue was, and I went to verify to see if the guy who was laughing about, the dollar not responding the way that people thought, because again, the point was when Trump imposed that or made that announcement, at least against some currencies, the dollar fell, right? And so, again, I saw a guy saying, this is funny that they say that Econ 101, and yet it doesn't happen every time Trump's done that, the dollar's fallen. So I didn't go back and verify with each particular episode, but I was noticing that on prior occasions when Trump would make a particularly aggressive announcement that kind of, rattled markets, it's not just that stocks would fall, but the dollar would fall too. Okay, and so then, that's one of the issues is why is that the case? Okay, so that's kind of the stuff I want to touch on here. I'm not going to give you folks any definitive, and here's what I think, and the case is closed. Now that you know the truth with a capital T, you can move on. That's not my purpose in this episode. I just want to link some of these things together and give you the intuition just so you know what people are talking about. And again, like I said, it's a neat result. It's counterintuitive at the least. And it's just, I like stuff like that in economics, right? Where you might think, the way to help women is to have paid family leave, right? Like to say, if you're a full-time employee and you get pregnant, then we'll give you a full year off and with pay. And you might think that that's good that's pro-woman or something, right? And actually, not necessarily, because other things equal, that would make employers more reluctant to hire women, particularly if they're married and, in their mid to late 20s. Because those, statistically, they're way more likely to get pregnant than if you hired some guy or a woman who was unmarried or a woman who was married but she was 50. right? So that's, and so that, where would that show? And if they did hire them, there might be an impact on how much you paid them, because implicitly you would be factoring in there's a higher chance that I'm going to have to pay them when they don't come to work for a year. And so how much would I agree on the front end to pay them? Well, clearly that's going to, other things equal, reduce the amount you'd offer them. So the people who are hurt the most by a measure like that are women, a married 27-year-old woman who isn't planning on having kids, right? Because she's going to be lumped in statistically with the people that are most likely to take advantage of that mandated option and, suffer the consequences accordingly. Okay, so I'm just saying, in general, that sort of thing happens all the time when you study economics, particularly from a free market perspective, where it looks like, oh, government interventions that aim to have this particular effect either cause the opposite thing, or there's some mechanism that they don't take into account that makes it disappear. Okay, so let me go ahead and jump right into the Lerner Symmetry Theorem. Also, let me just mention, if you're interested in the history of economic thought, this is a neat little article to read because it's not that difficult. Right? I mean, there's some math and stuff in it, but it's not incomprehensible if you're a modern trained economist. But his motivation, let me just read the first paragraph here. This note does not arrive at any conclusions not previously obtained by Bastable, Marshall, and Pagoo, but it shows the nature of the slip which led Edgeworth to conclusions contrary to theirs, and demonstrates the applicability of Marshall's, quote, offer curve apparatus to the elucidation of this problem. All right, and then he's got this real long footnote where he's going through Edgeworth, and that's the Edgeworth box guy, if you've ever used those devices in your classroom instruction. And the point is, Edgeworth had disagreed with some of these writers on the impact of an import, of a tariff versus an export tax. And Edgeworth thought he had isolated that, no, there's clearly a difference there. And these other writers who thought otherwise, because they, the math misled them. And what Lerner is pointing out is, no, Edgeworth he was focused on what the government did with the revenue. And Edgeworth erroneously thought that his conclusion, like that he was getting a different conclusion because they screwed up their analysis when he was focusing on the source of the tax revenue. But really, Edgeworth's conclusion flipped because of how the government was spending the money. All right. And then what makes it extra ironic or funny is, so this is Lerner talking. He says, one purpose of this note is to exonerate the mathematical method from Edgeworth's error, and then he's got a dash, a task in which I am emboldened by my experience in having repeated this error in a seminar at the London School of Economics. Okay, so my point, in case you kind of got lost there, is Lerner is sort of taking Edgeworth out to the woodshed saying, oh no, he messed something up. Let me spell this out. And you can see what's going on, the real situation here. But then in a footnote, he says, by the way, this error that Edgeworth made in print, I also made myself when I was presenting this material, beforehand at the London School of Economics. And then now, I came to realize, oh yeah, I just screwed that up. And so here, let me now write this note to Economica to explain Edgeworth's mistake that I repeated. Okay. So anyway, big picture, just to give the intuition, the claim is, the counterintuitive claim is that under certain conditions, if a government imposes an import tax, that is equivalent to them importing an export tax, right? And so again, like take the case of the U.S. If this were to literally hold for the United States, it would be like saying, yeah, all the stuff Trump wants to do with these tariffs, right? And that he thinks that's going to have all these impacts on, creating American jobs and everything. And it's going to, stick it to the foreigners, and it's going to help U.S. industry. And presumably you think it would hurt U.S. exporters as well. And it's going to reduce the trade deficit, right? Like that's part of them. Trump thinks a trade deficit is like analogous to a corporate loss. Like I've heard Trump many times say things along those lines. Like it's clear that Trump is thinking as like a CEO or a business owner and thinking of the United States as a giant company. And in his mental framework, he views a trade deficit as if, we had a bad quarter, that our expenses were higher than our revenues or something. And so hence it's like a loss. If we imported more stuff than we sold, he views it as like, our costs of goods sold was higher than our revenues or something. All right. And that's just not the right way to look at it, for one thing. But I'm saying, given that's his mentality, and a lot of times, I think it's safe to say, crude mercantilist views, you can see why you would think tariffs would be the way to address some of those issues. And like, if you don't like massive trade deficits, go ahead and slap on a tariff, right? Because that will make Americans import less, so that will bring down the trade deficit, right? And it'll boost U.S. job. And so the central result in Lerner Symmetry Theorem is that whatever impact you think imposing a high tax on imports is going to have, you would have the identical results if instead of doing that, you imposed a big tax on U.S. exporters. So anytime American farmers wanted to sell wheat abroad, you put a big tax on that. Or anytime, American jet manufacturers wanted to export engines or, full vehicles abroad, the U.S. government would slap a big tax on that. And that would do the same thing to reduce the trade deficit and create U.S. jobs as the import tariff. Okay. So again, at first, when you first hear that, it's like, how could that be possible? So let me walk you through the logic of it. So in Lerner's article, he proves that it's true in a very special, unrealistic case. All right. So it just assumes there's two countries and two goods. And originally, there's no, what would be called capital inflows. Like they have balanced trade, put it that way. There's no trade deficit. There's, no frictions, no transaction costs, stuff like that. And then he just looks at that simplistic world and shows, yep, it's mathematically equivalent. If a given one of the countries imposes, another assumption is there's no retaliation, right? So if one country imposes a tariff on the other country, or on imports from the other country, to be more accurate, you don't assume that the other country is allowed to retaliate, right? So just saying isolate what are the effects of the one country changing its tax policy vis-a-vis international goods. And again, the result he shows is if they impose a 10% tariff on incoming imports, that is identical in terms of the economic impact of that, as if instead of doing that, they had imposed a 10% tax on exports that its own people were trying to send abroad. So what happens? What's the mechanism? Well, put simply, as I probably led you to anticipate earlier by my remarks, it's that it impacts the currency. All right, so let's switch to the context of the U.S. When the U.S., we're in original equilibrium, exporters export stuff, importers import stuff. We have whatever the situation is. And now all of a sudden, out of the blue, Trump decides to impose new tariffs. What does that do? The immediate impact is it makes foreign goods a lot more expensive to Americans than they were the day before, right? And so what does that make them do? Well, it makes them not want to buy as much foreign goods, right? They switch to domestic versions, or they just do without, okay? But you can't stop the analysis there, right? And in terms of standard economic theory, you would say what I just said would be a partial equilibrium analysis. But if you want to do a general equilibrium analysis, you need to do the change, the policy change, imposing a tariff in this case, and then compute the new equilibrium where everything settles down in the model. And then you can say, now that's the general equilibrium consideration and impact. Okay, so one of the things that's clearly going to change is Americans now who previously were importing stuff are not doing it either as much or at all. And so what does that do on the foreign exchange markets? It meant previously Americans who wanted to import stuff, they were using dollars to at some point, whether they were doing it themselves or they were buying it from the importer who then, was doing it, at some point along the way, what had to happen, like if the U.S. is buying cars from Japan, is that dollars were being used to fetch yen because ultimately the people selling cars in Japan are getting paid in yen. All right. And so dollars were being used to buy yen. And so now, because of Trump coming in and all of a sudden making, slapping on a new tax on Japanese cars being purchased by Americans, that makes Americans less willing to buy Japanese cars. They're willing to spend, they want to spend, I should say, fewer dollars on Japanese cars. And so the dollar strengthens against the yen. And that might be counter too. You might have thought the dollar would fall, but no. That they're not as eager. People are not as eager to spend dollars on yen. Okay. So that makes the dollar strengthen against the yen. And so now what happens? Suppose you were an American wheat farmer and you previously exported wheat to Japan. The tariff per se does not directly impact that at all. So you might have thought, well, that shouldn't be affected, right? Yeah, the importation of Japanese cars should go down, but we want the wheat exports to stay the same because we're trying to shrink the trade deficit. But that's not what's going to happen, right? Because now the stronger dollar means, from the Japanese perspective, U.S. wheat is more expensive than it was yesterday. Even though the dollar figure is the same, now the dollar has become more expensive in terms of yen. And so the yen price of wheat went up. All right. And so that's going to make the Japanese import, from their point of view, less American wheat than they did before. And so, yep, it's true. Imposing a tariff on Japanese cars or all imports from Japan will, other things equal, reduce imports from Japan, but it will also reduce exports to Japan by having the dollar strengthen. Okay, so it's not I want to be clear here. The claim is not that the tax won't affect international trade. That's not the claim, right? You might be thinking, oh, so the dollar strengthens and completely offsets it, and so Japanese cars, yep, the tariff makes them 10% more expensive, but then the price falls 10%. The effective dollar price, and so therefore it's a complete wash. And no, that's not the claim. Definitely, even when the dust settles and the dollar has strengthened, Japanese cars are still more expensive to U.S. consumers, including the change in the currency and including the new tariff, than it was before, or than they were before. But the claim is, when the dust settles, it's still the case, or it's also the case, that American wheat priced in yen is more expensive for Japanese importers than it was before. And so that's why they buy fewer bushels of U.S. wheat. And so, yep, the amount of cars sent to Americans from Japan does go down. But guess what? The amount of wheat sent from the U.S. to Japan also goes down. And so the trade deficit does not shrink as much as you thought it would have. And in fact, maybe it doesn't shrink at all. So again, the volumes of imports and exports shrink, but because the deficit is the difference between the two, it's not obvious that you're going to do much about the deficit per se, if that's what your ostensible goal was. Okay, so that's the basic result. Now let me give you, and I told you like what the mechanism was. the intuition for seeing like, wow, I wasn't expecting that. Why would a tax on imports be kind of equivalent to a tax on exports if you take money out of it, or monies, plural, because in these examples, there's two currencies. If you just think of it as international barter, well, then it's really obvious why that's the case. All right. And I owe this point to Scott Sumner. He was the first one to say it that I saw say it. I'm guessing he just read it somewhere else because it's a pretty standard point once you think about it. But if you were in a world where people didn't use money, or at least not for international trade, and all you did when it came to international trade was people made bilateral exchanges, mutually agreed upon, that, some wheat farmer wanted cars from Japan and vice versa. And, the wheat farmer said, I'm going to send you, hey, Mr. Car dealer over there, I'm going to send you this many bushels of wheat. And then you make sure on the next ship out of Tokyo, there's an extra Toyota waiting for me. And that's what the trade between Japan and the United States looked like. And every single transaction just had real goods on both sides. Well, then it would be crystal clear, right? If Trump came in and that was what the status quo had been and said, oh, from now on, any American who wants to import stuff from Japan, I'm going to impose a 10% tax on those transactions. It would be crystal clear in that setting or that context that by Trump taxing imports from Japan, he was simultaneously and equivalently taxing exports to Japan. Because every single transaction, if it were in kind, would simultaneously be an import and an export, right? The very transaction by which the American wheat farmers imported Japanese cars would, just by flipping the coin, even though there's no coin here, that's the whole point, would simultaneously or equivalently be the U.S. wheat farmers exporting wheat to Japan. So if you're taxing that transaction, clearly you are disincentivizing or penalizing imports and exports with one fell stroke, right? You're necessarily doing the same thing. Those are just the different ways of describing the same thing you're doing. Okay. So that should help give you some intuition. Because again, I told you some of the assumptions when Lerner went through to actually prove his result mathematically is he assumed in the beginning, the original status quo before one of the countries imposes an import tax, he assumed that they had balanced trade. And then that's how he's able to make it go through mathematically. And so notice in my barter example, if you took out money and just assumed that countries, their citizens traded with each other in terms of what's called direct exchange, just goods for goods, notice in that framework or that kind of setting, those countries necessarily would have balanced trade with each other, right? Because, that however X bushels of wheat trading for one car from Japan, if that's the market price, with each transaction, you say, oh, how many imports were there? And you could say like one car worth. You say, how many exports? Well, X barrels or bushels of wheat. And you say, well, was that balanced? And say, yes, because that's the same market price, market value. All right, so imports would always equal exports necessarily if you weren't using money. Okay. Now, what ends up happening? Well, let me just drive home that point again. So again, what I'm trying to get you to see is it's not surprising when you reflect upon it that Lerner is able to prove mathematically that if you start out with countries, where there's no frictions and things like that, and they originally have balanced trade with each other, that if one of the governments imposes an import tax, that is equivalent to them imposing an export tax on their own people, on their own producers, and that it's not going to have any impact on the trade deficit. Right? It will restrict the absolute flow of goods both ways, but it'll restrict it to the same degree. And it's obvious when you say, oh, because just imagine the case of literal barter, where clearly that's going to be the impact. And originally there was no trade deficit. And when the dust settles, there's also going to be no trade deficit. It's just imports and exports would have been reduced, depending on how, steep the tariff is. Okay. One other interesting quirk from that analysis is I think Lerner shows this in his paper, and then others, have elaborated upon it. But one implication of that, if you're with me so far and can at least take these results insofar as they go, one implication is, what if what the government did is impose tariffs, taxes on imports, it raises revenue from them, and then what if it used that revenue not to give a lump sum rebate to people or to cut income tax rates or to fund a Green New Deal or pay for Social Security, whatever. What if it used those new revenues from the new tariff to subsidize exports, right? So you put a tax on imports, and then the money you raise, you turn around and you say to exporters, hey, for every, like you say to the American wheat farmer, you know what? Not only are we going to refrain from taxing you, but for every bushel of wheat that you export to Japan, we'll give you an extra $1 from the federal government. What do you think about that? All right, so you would think that 1-2 punch of putting a tax on Japanese cars and subsidizing American wheat exports to Japan, you would think that would really shrink the trade deficit with Japan, right? And actually, no, that would largely just be a wash, at least in the Lerner framework. Because just think it through, a tax on imports under certain conditions is equivalent to a tax on exports, right? So that means a subsidy is like a negative tax, right? So what that means, a corollary of that is to say, oh, a subsidy given to the exporters is equivalent to a subsidy given to the importers, right? Because again, a subsidy is just a negative tax. And so then what that means is if you were to tax imports and subsidize exports, that's equivalent to you taxing imports and subsidizing imports. And so imagine now if they said to the people trying to import cars from Japan, hey, we're going to impose what works out to, like, it could be levied as a percentage, but suppose the way the math works out, it ends up being, $1,000 for every car that you import from Japan. You're going to owe us $1,000 for every car as a new tariff. But then for every car you import from Japan, we'll pay you $1,000 to subsidize that activity. And you can see how those two would cancel out. And so when all is said and done, you wouldn't be doing anything. Okay? And so you can see how if they literally did it to the same thing, it would be a wash. It would just be kind of pointless. And so that's why, again, if the conditions for Lerner symmetry hold, it would also be likewise completely a wash and just pointless if they taxed imports and used the revenue to subsidize exports. Once the dust settled, it would just be a wash. Okay, and so armed with that result, Scott Sumner made the joke that he was saying with some of his friends, because they don't like Trump. They especially don't like, his rhetoric on trade. They think he's ignorant of economics. And so they're saying what we should do is plant some moles, in Trump circles and say, hey, not only should you guys tax imports to make America great again, but why don't you really seal the deal and use the revenue that you raise to subsidize U.S. exports? That'll really stick it to people. That'll really shrink that trade deficit, huh? And then they would be chortling behind the scenes knowing that the subsidies to the exporters would just undo, to a first approximation, the economic fallout from the import tax. Okay? All right. So now they've walked you through that. Let me now explain, okay, but surely there's more to the story here. Okay, so one thing is, what happens if you don't originally start from balanced trade? All right. And in particular, they do use money, and that also opens up the idea that there could be intertemporal transactions. Okay, so strictly speaking, before it, I was talking about they don't use money, they just do it in kind. Without the use of money, you could still have a trade deficit in the sense, what if people buy cars from Japan and they don't use money? What instead they do is they send over IOUs and say, I owe you whatever, the equivalent of 1.1 cars next year if you give me a car right now. Okay, so that would be counted as a part of the trade deficit, right? Because the car coming in would be an import and there would be no corresponding export. All right. But obviously in the real world, the way that's all facilitated is with the use of money. And yes, you have debt contracts, but they're denominated in money. Okay. So that's why the perfect symmetry does not necessarily hold. That's something that can break the symmetry. Because again, if it were just in kind and people in Japan were sending cars to people who were sending bushels of wheat in exchange, then clearly trying to tax imports is the same thing as taxing exports. But if you break this symmetry and it's like, no, technically what happens is there's, one set of transactions is really just imports where people are sending money to the Japanese in exchange for cars. And then a different set of transactions are clearly exports where, a bunch of American farmers are exporting wheat in exchange for money. And so you've broken those transactions up. And so that's why in principle, you could tax one and that's not necessarily the same thing. And then, as I'm saying, more broadly, you can see why, given that you have broken it up like that, it's not necessarily identical and just exaggerated to see the intuition. Suppose you start out from an original position where the U.S. is just importing cars from Japan and not exporting anything to them at all. Well, then obviously it can't possibly be the case that imposing a 10% tax on Japanese imports of cars has the same effect on the U.S. economy as imposing a 10% tax on exports of wheat to Japan, if by assumption in this particular scenario we're analyzing, it's possible that there are a bunch of car imports and zero wheat exports, right? So among other things, if you imposed a tax on something that wasn't happening, you would raise $0 in revenue, right? So how could they be equivalent, right? All right. So again, the reason that differs from what I was saying before is here we don't have the fact that the imports and the exports are just flip sides of the same coin, that they're different. Now, what ends up happening, just in case you're wondering, like, what, that is weird, what's going on? It's because why would it's the time element, right? And that really complicates everything. And so why is it, in the grand scheme, why are the Japanese being so foolish as to go into factories and sweat like crazy and make all these cool vehicles, very dependable? They put them on ships and send them across the ocean, and the Americans never have to give them any goodies. Like, that seems kind of crazy. Why would they do that? Right? Like, that's what would happen, when Caesar went around and conquered the neighboring regions. Why did he do that? Well, among other things, they would send him tribute, right? So a conquering empire has regions around the world sending them goodies for, without sending stuff out in exchange. So why would the Japanese do that to the U.S.? And you could say, well, could they drop nuclear weapons on them? But that's presumably not what's going on right here in this one instance, right? And so why is that? And the answer, of course, is that they're not getting wheat or jet aircraft. They're building up financial assets denominated in U.S. dollars, and that they consider that to be part of their financial wealth, and that down the road, among other things, that could fuel consumption, for example. Okay, so that's one way of looking at it. If you were just going to do an intertemporal exchange, and for example, suppose what the Japanese sent were 100 cars this year, and what they received in exchange was not just a certain number of bushels of wheat, and it was just a spot transaction that was like a barter in kind, but instead what they did is they sent 100 cars this year, And what they received was the financial wherewithal to perpetually get 1 bushel of wheat forever from the United States. Right? So that's another way of viewing it. So, in principle, you could make exchanges like that, intertemporal, and trade a bunch of present goods in exchange for a flow of future goods. But I'm saying the way the trade statistics are calculated and whatnot, clearly there would be a huge import on the front end of the United States where they would have a trade deficit with Japan. They would get a bunch of cars now in exchange just for 1 bushel of wheat, which doesn't have the same market value as the 100 cars. And then if nothing else happened, in subsequent years, it would flip. And Japan would have a tiny trade deficit with the U.S. It wouldn't have what's called a current account deficit if you're a purist on this stuff. Okay, so I'm just explaining how these things are quantified and how intertemporal transactions kind of makes things way more complicated, but I just want to give you the framework so you know how to think about it. All right. So, anyway, that's how you start realizing, the limitations of Lerner's original framework. Having said all that, though, still, I think it's useful to work through that just to get the first approximation. Just like our standard results in economics, like with comparative advantage. If there's one country whose workers are better at everything, do they benefit from free trade? And, how do you analyze that? We can use little thought experiments and do stuff. Well, suppose there's 2 countries with 2 goods and you can walk through and just see the logic. That doesn't mean in the real world there's countries with just 2 goods, but it is, I think, useful to walk through those simpler examples. Just like, why do we study what's called Robinson Crusoe economics? And it's because you can actually build up a lot of the logic of markets and capital accumulation and standard concepts like consumption and income and saving and things like that, just by considering Robinson Crusoe on his isolated island picking coconuts with his bare hands at first. And then if I save some of those and live below my means and build up a stockpile, then in future days I can eat those coconuts and draw down my savings while I go and get some sticks together and build a ladder. And then I can do this and I can go build take a stick and sharpen it so I can go get fish and right. There's a lot you can do with that. That doesn't mean, we think the real world right now is basically like a guy deserted on an island somewhere. That's not the point, but it lets you think through the implications of certain ways of thinking. Okay? So that's what I would say likewise with this Lerner Symmetry Theorem, that yes, its assumptions were very strong to make the result go through, but just thinking through the logic of it, I think that does show, one of the things that happens when a government imposes a tariff, at least other things equal, is you would expect its currency to strengthen. And that at least partially offsets the initial prima facie impact of that tariff. Okay. So incidentally, just to continue that train of thought, that was the point that Stephen Moran was making in his 41-page document that he released, before becoming the head of Trump's Council of Economic Advisors, where he was explaining how tariffs and other tools could be used to revamp international trade and the global financial system in ways that would benefit the United States. Okay, so real quickly, his point was, we can, among other things, impose tariffs, and then I think he wanted to use some of the revenue to reduce income tax rates or something like that. And he was saying, just because we impose a tariff does not mean that all of a sudden foreign goods are going to just be that much more expensive to U.S. consumers. Because he was saying that effect will partially be undone by the strengthening of the U.S. dollar, the appreciation of the U.S. dollar. Okay. And you might say, well, so is it a wash? No, but his point was now we've raised revenue, right? That's where he was coming from. he was saying what we could do is impose tariffs that will raise a bunch of revenue for the Treasury that we can do to like reduce income taxes or other things that are distortionary. And some of the brunt of that tax hike on imports will be partially undone by the strengthening dollar. That was his argument. Okay. So he wasn't saying it was a complete wash. His point was, though, this is a way we can raise revenue and partially shield the consumers from the full impact of that. Whereas if we raised like domestic sales taxes or something, yep, that's going to make stuff more expensive, and there's not some countervailing force, he was arguing, that, would cushion the blow to consumers. They were just going to have to eat it. Okay. Why don't I just conclude then with some of the possible explanations for why in practice hasn't this been happening, right? So again, I just showed you how it's pretty standard in terms of international trade theory to assume that, other things equal, if a government imposes a new tariff, that should make the currency of that government strengthen in the foreign exchange markets. And yet, in practice, there were several times since Trump came back into office where he made what was a surprise announcement. And how do you know? Like, because you could see it rattled markets, right? Like the stock market fell and everything like that. And also, it's not just that the stock market fell, but the dollar often would fall against other major currencies in response to this news. And so the question is, well, why is that? Shouldn't be the other way around. I thought the whole point was a tariff makes your currency appreciate, not depreciate. All right. So I have not done enough research for me to I'm not here saying which one I think is the right answer. I'm just explaining some of the candidates that I've seen people offer that, are plausible contenders. Okay. So one thing is people could fear retaliation, right? So in all this discussion that I've said so far in this episode, we have assumed the other countries don't retaliate, right? And so if your country imposes a 10% tariff, and we just walk through the implications of that, holding everything else equal, but what if, because your country does that, what if foreigners now impose a 10% tariff against you? Okay, so there's that element. And so obviously if other things equal, you imposing your 10% tariff makes the dollar strengthen against the yen, okay, and you let the dust settle, and now the Japanese retaliate and they impose a 10% tariff on U.S. imports into their country, well, using the same analysis from that new starting point, that would make the yen strengthen against the dollar. And so that would largely undo the first thing. And then if in general, because the two, because each of those tax hikes is distortionary, well, now the whole world is poorer, and it's not clear. It can't be that both the dollar and the yen strengthen against each other on net. Obviously, that's impossible. But you can see how once you allow for retaliation, it's no longer obvious which way it goes. You have to make assumptions about it. And so I could see, given that the U.S. is such a dominant force and has such a large trade deficit, you could see the argument being made that, the U.S. is more dependent, at least on the margin, on international trade, and that, disturbances to that would impact U.S. markets more than others. And so I can see why, you might say, all right, especially once you allow for the fact that Trump, and also too, that he's being erratic, right? It's not that this is just some formula that was announced 2 months ahead of time. And, it was citing the economic literature, because there is a whole literature on optimal tariff theory. And that's one of the things that Stephen Moran, again, trained economics from PhD economics from Harvard, that he was citing that literature, right? That there's a thing saying that the U.S. has control over the global price of commodities. And so in particular, there's an argument that the U.S. could impose at least modest tariffs without severely distorting things, and you could make arguments that it could end up benefiting all things considered. By the way, I don't endorse all that stuff. I'm just saying it's not the case that the only economists advising Trump are mired in the year 1650 and that they haven't read Adam Smith or David Ricardo and, they don't know anything about international trade. No, there are cutting edge neoclassical peer-reviewed models in the, top journals, blah, 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 that say within a certain range, the U.S. could impose a tariff and that would actually end up benefiting Americans on net. Okay. And Stephen Moran was citing that literature and saying, so why don't we do that? And then with the revenue we raise, I'm not saying go and waste it on, boondoggle government projects. I'm saying, why don't we cut taxes, or why don't we, at least reduce the deficit, or blah, 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 right? Stuff like that. Okay. But even though the Trump administration has guys like Moran in his corner, in practice, what they've been doing with tariffs thus far has not been a carefully explained, transparent, rational policy calibrated to the empirical estimates of the literature for economic optimality. No, that's not at all what's been going on. It's, all right, we got these big tariffs. Whoa, markets crash. Whoa, hey, I was just kind of kidding about that. Pump the brakes. We're in negotiations. We're like, oh, okay, markets recover. China, 100%. Bam, markets crash. No. We're working things out. I just had to show them who's boss, right? So I'm saying with this stuff, once you factor in all of that, it's not clear that this sort of, baseline initial result from a 1936 economics article is the way to think about it. That there's a heck of a lot more going on than just each time Trump makes an announcement to just say, okay, the U.S. now has imposed a tariff and everything else is going to stay the same. That no, this is like part of a cat and mouse game or an arms race or whatever metaphor you want to use. And every time something like this happens, that probably makes international investors more concerned about the credibility of the U.S. government and things like that. And so I could see how every time something like this happens, the dollar actually ends up falling, especially when you take into account the retaliation that may occur. Because it's kind of like either this is just a bluff and Trump is just doing this as a negotiating tactic. And so, yeah, you're not thinking that over the next 2 years, this is going to be the new rate. Or if it is, then probably other countries are going to retaliate. And that's going to be the new normal, right? So either way, it's not that you would think people taking that into account that the dollar should respond as if this were just, oh, yeah, those tariffs on China are just the new normal and everything else is the same as it was and will be the same as it was except for that one shift. That's not the way you would expect things to play out. Okay, and then another one I will mention is to the extent that people think this is indicative of something that's going to hurt the economy, well, then maybe that's going to make the Fed more likely to have looser policy in the future. And so that could make the dollar weaken in and of itself. And that's just another variable to throw into the mix. And so that's why when Trump comes out of nowhere and shocks markets with an announcement that, because another way of putting it is you probably wouldn't think the stock market should fall as much as it does every time Trump does something like that. And I don't necessarily think that's just because traders are emotional or things like that. It's partly because, they're trying to extrapolate as much information as possible from what's a very noisy signal. And when Trump makes an announcement, it's not just that, but then that's giving you more information about what do you think's coming down the road. And so, again, when you start playing that long game in your head strategically, you can get a better sense of why it might be that when Trump surprises people with this announcement of a very large tariff, that it makes people think, among other implications, oh yeah, the economy is going to be weaker now than I thought last week, and the Fed is going to have to open up the monetary spigots to try to offset that more than I thought was going to be the case a week ago. And so that's why I now think the dollar is going to be weaker against these other currencies than I did last week. And that's why the dollar would also fall on the news. Okay, I will wrap it up there. Thanks everybody for your attention. We'll see you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.